last chapter of Nehemiah. Nehemiah chapter 13. Okay, let's look at the first two verses. On that day, and that day was the day when they dedicated the walls, if you remember, when they separated into two groups, and one went on one part of the wall, another went on the other part of the wall, and there was lots of celebrating and singing and a lot of praising God, even some sacrifices. It was a very special day. So on that day, it's almost like they concluded the thing with reading aloud the book of Moses. And the book of Moses would be the Pentateuch, or what we call the first 5 books of the Old Testament. But primarily from this, you take it that they were really kind of focusing in on Exodus and Leviticus and Deuteronomy, which would really get into the more technical aspects of the law of Moses. So again, on that day, they read aloud from the book of Moses in the hearing of the people, so that everybody could hear. And you can imagine, you can almost picture them doing this from atop the walls, where this had been taking place. And there was found in it, in the book of Moses, that no Ammonite, and no Moabite should ever enter the assembly of God. No Ammonite, these are spelled out specifically. These two specific foreigners, they looked back and saw in the law that they should not enter the assembly of God. And here's why. Because they did not meet the sons of Israel with bread and water, but hired Balaam against them to curse them. However, our God turned the curse into a blessing. So it seems to me that the more the people of Judah were exposed to God's word, the more they learned about God's standards. And it's really sad that it appears that some of the things that they discovered when they read the book of Moses and they read the laws of Moses, that some of this is foreign to them. They didn't know anything about it. They didn't know there was such a law. They didn't know there was such a restriction. And this is an example of that here. So here, they're making reference to what we read in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verses 3 and 4. Because there it says that the Ammonites and the Moabites could only be a part of the assembly of God's people if they rejected their false gods and embraced Yahweh, or embraced the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as the only true God. Not a God, not a true God, but the true God. And not too many Ammonites or Moabites were willing to go that far. Okay. So the interesting thing in this is that this happened 1,000 years beforehand, when they would not extend kindness to God's people as they were preparing to enter the promised land, did not give them bread and water, as he said. That happened 1,000 years before this time. All right. And then this idea is cemented by God's promise to Abraham in Genesis chapter 12, where he said, I will bless those who talked about. He told Abraham, I'm going to bless you with a huge nation of people. They're going to be more numerous than the stars of the sea and the sands of the seashore, and blah, blah, blah. And I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse him who curses you. So God is kind of making good on this promise in Genesis 12:3 when he says in Deuteronomy chapter 23, no Ammonites or Moabites are allowed in the assembly of my people. Okay? In Numbers 22 through 24, we know the story of Balaam. You probably remember a little bit of the story of Balaam. What's the most famous thing about Balaam?
Talking donkey.
The talking donkey, the donkey that talked to him. That's kind of what we remember Balaam about. The donkey turned around and talked to him. I don't know. And then what's funny to me is Balaam answered the donkey. I figured he would have been so shocked he would have jumped off the donkey and ran away, but instead he starts talking to the donkey and they carry on a conversation, which is weird in itself. But the bigger story about Balaam is that he was a foreign prophet. He wasn't a prophet of God, but he was a prophet. Okay, and he was hired by Balak. I know Balaam and Balak sound a lot alike, but Balak was the king of Moab, and he hired Balaam to curse Israel. And it's really an interesting story, because every time Balaam tried to curse God's people, he couldn't do it. He couldn't do it. Have you ever seen that Jim Carrey movie called Liar Liar? You ever see it? It's kind of like that. Every time Jim Carrey tried to tell a lie, he couldn't. Only the truth came out of him, And it was so frustrating to him, until he finally learned to live with the fact that he couldn't lie anymore. Well, obviously, Balaam, in a way, was a liar that could not lie, because every time he tried to curse God's people, it turned into a blessing. Well, that just made King Balak even more and more angry, And Balaam was trying to tell him, look, I can't help it. I'm powerless against this God. He's making it impossible for me to do this. But God has not forgotten the fact that the king of the Moabites, king of Moab, Balak, had hired a prophet to curse his people. And so God still remembers that. He can only bless them every time he tried to curse them. So I made this statement in the sermon Sunday that unforgiven sins are not forgotten by God. That happened 1,000 years ago when the Ammonites and the Moabites would not let Israel pass through their territories, and did not give them hospitality. And Balak went one step further by trying to get a prophet to curse the people of God, hopefully so they'd turn around and go back, that kind of thing. God hadn't forgotten that. God hadn't forgotten that. And so God, through Moses, said, people from Moab and people from Ammon, they can't enter here. They can't be a part of your assembly. Okay? And apparently, these people in Nehemiah's time are hearing this for the first time. Okay? So, which is kind of a bad sign. All right, so let's look at verse 3. So, when they heard the law, they excluded all the foreigners from Israel. To me, I just see this as another positive sign of the influence that Ezra and Nehemiah had on these people. That they not only said, well, we shouldn't be doing that, but they said, it's not too late to correct that. Let's get rid of them. Let's expel them. Okay? So that's exactly what. Pardon me.
Interrupt real quick.
Yeah.
The end of the story of Balaam,
Yeah.
we don't see in the Old Testament actually, and I've
No.
forgotten where, but it's revealed in the New Testament.
Yes, yeah.
Where Balaam said, okay, I can't curse
Curse,
God's
yeah.
people, but he then gives King of Moab advice.
Yeah.
And of course,
And the advice was bad, but it worked.
that's going to come into play in this chapter, of course.
Yeah.
But the advice is, okay, if you want to get them, send foreign women in.
Yeah.
And
That worked.
that worked.
But that was a plan that he had concocted, not that God had
Right,
put into his head.
exactly.
Yeah.
Balaam said, okay, I can't curse them.
But that is the rest of the story.
But here's what you can do.
Yeah. All right, so spoiler alert, Randy lives. Okay, but anyway, the truth is the people of Judah did the right thing. They did the right thing without yielding to obstacles and without expressing excuses. In other words, when they found that this 1,000-year-old incident had resulted in God making a law against the Ammonites and the Moabites, they didn't say, well, that command was made a long time ago. And it just speaks to a different time. That's what we hear today. That's what we hear from today from people who say, that we should be more accepting of homosexuals in the church, and that's what we hear. Well, that's today is different. And certainly the people of Judah could have used that excuse instead of expelling the Moabites and the Ammonites. Okay, but they didn't use that excuse. Nor did they say, well, things are different now. And nor did they say, well, come on, now let's not go that far. You can take this to extremes, and that kind of thing. Aren't we supposed to love other people and this kind of thing and so forth? You didn't see that out of them. They got busy and expelled the foreigners because that's what God had told them to do. Now, I ended up by saying this. Let's be clear. Everyone is welcome in this assembly. In our assembly, everyone is welcome. And we shouldn't ever tell anybody, you're not welcome here, because you are welcome. This is where you're going to find counsel about God and about the church and how God expects you to live your lives. And this is where you're going to find love from us and so forth. But I also said, but those whose commitment is incomplete, or those who continue to willfully exhibit a sinful lifestyle, should be understood as to exactly where they stand among us. You are welcome here, but you know what? There are some things that you do that we don't find acceptable. You know, I'm not going to mention any names, but it wasn't that many years ago that we had a person who never really was like a bona fide member, I wouldn't say, but this person was here, you know, fairly often. But he shacked up with a woman, you know, and I told him repeatedly, I said, you know, you just can't do that, you know. You understand why you can't do that, you know. You're living in a sinful relationship with this woman, and you know, I said, you're welcome to stay here, but you're just not going to be able to lead a prayer, or, you know, preside over the Lord's Supper or things like that, because you're living really a defiant and willfully sinful lifestyle. And he would just smile and say, well, yeah, I know, you know, but he never did anything about it, you know. But don't misunderstand me. I was not unkind to him at all. I was very kind to him, but I also would pat him on the back and say, you know you can do better than that. You know that's not right, you know. But he just couldn't not do it, you know. And I think sometimes we have to say to other people, we love you, but you know what? That's just not right, you know. Otherwise, it's almost as if we just condone anything, you know. And it's obvious from this passage that God does not. He doesn't smile on that when we, you know, just willfully turn a blind eye to sin among those of us who are a part of our assembly and so forth. So that's just a little, you know, editorial there, I guess, for lack of a better word. All right, let's move on. Next 6 verses. Now, prior to this, okay, now this he's talking about is when they decided they were going to expel all the foreigners from the assembly, okay? So prior to this incident, when they expelled the foreigners from the assembly, Eliashib, the priest, who was appointed over the chambers of the house of our God. And what is the house of our God?
The temple.
The temple, okay. So Eliashib was appointed to be in charge of the chambers of the house of our God. And it says he was related to Tobiah. Remember Tobiah and Sanballat and all the trouble they gave Nehemiah in the early days of the book of Nehemiah? How they just rebelled. They didn't want the temple rebuilt. They didn't want the walls rebuilt. They didn't, you know, they just rebelled against everything and did everything they could to resist. Okay. Well, it says here that Eliashib was related to Tobiah and had prepared a large room for him where formerly they put the grain offerings, the frankincense, the utensils, and the tithes of grain, wine, and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. So this area of the temple, this large room, which was supposed to have been used to store grain offerings and frankincense and utensils and tithes of grain and wine and oil prescribed for the Levites, the singers, and the gatekeepers, and the contributions for the priests. During all this time, I was not in Jerusalem, for in the 32nd year of Artaxerxes, king of Babylon, I had gone to the king. And after some time, however, I asked leave from the king, and I came to Jerusalem and learned about the evil that Eliashib had done for Tobiah by preparing a room for him in the courts of the house of God. It was very displeasing to me. So I threw all of Tobiah's household goods out of the room. Then I gave an order, and they cleansed the rooms. And I returned there, and the utensils of the house of God with the grain offerings and the frankincense. Okay, let's see if I make that. All right. First of all, the book of Nehemiah begins in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes. Okay, so if it begins in the 20th year, that's when, if you remember, King Artaxerxes saw Nehemiah kind of moping around. Nehemiah was his cupbearer and so forth. What are you sad about and so forth? And he tells Artaxerxes finally, well, you know, the condition of my homeland is just terrible. And then you know the story how he was so blessed by King Artaxerxes who gave him permission, gave him provisions, sent him back to Jerusalem. It ended up making him governor of Judah, you know, and this kind of thing. But it tells us here that Nehemiah talks about returning to his duties in Persia in the 32nd year. And he implies in this that during those 12 years, he must have gone back and forth. And that sometimes he was away from Jerusalem for long periods of time. And the sad thing about it to me is, it seems like when he was away from Jerusalem, they kind of returned to their old ways, you know. And so apparently word would get back to Nehemiah, and he would ask Artaxerxes, can I go home? There's some matters I need to. And from this we get the impression that Artaxerxes was very kind with Nehemiah and allowed him to do that. And poor old Nehemiah, it seemed like every time he went home, he had another mess to deal with, you know, and this was one of them. So he'd been gone. He comes back, and what does he find out? He finds Tobiah's got a room in the temple. Well, Tobiah's an Ammonite, okay? All right, so this was appalling to Nehemiah. But Elisha, who was the priest, was completely blind to it because that was his relative. We don't know how he was related to something. Tobiah might have been his son-in-law or something of that nature. But isn't it horrible that the priest would say, we don't need that storeroom. You take that room. And what was an Ammonite doing with a room in the temple? Now, even I know that's not right, you know. Only Jews were supposed to be in the temple. Only Jews. There was a courtyard for the Gentiles, but it was kind of far away, you know. But there he is. And so no wonder Nehemiah was upset. And Nehemiah was upset not only because Tobiah was an illegal alien in the house of God, but he was also an enemy who actively opposed the work of God through Nehemiah. So Nehemiah washed up the temple. He cleansed it. You know? And what did Jesus do about 400 years later? Isn't that exactly what he did? He walks into the temple and he loses his mind. And here we see this Jesus, a man of such rich compassion and love and caring for people. He kind of went halfway berserk and drove the money changers out of there. I don't know how many there were, but the story makes it sound like he single-handedly drove them all out of there. And he was up because he was that upset. And you know what? I believe that perhaps it wasn't so much that they were afraid of Jesus' imposing presence. I think the reason why Jesus was successful in driving out the money changers was because they knew what they were doing wasn't right anyway. They knew that wasn't right. They knew nobody was going to call their hand on it, or they thought that until Jesus did. And you can't convince me that Tobiah didn't know that he had no business in the temple. So Nehemiah says he's out of here. And then he said, everything, I get the impression that what Nehemiah did, anything that Tobiah touched, y'all clean it up. Anything that Gentile was involved with, get it out of here. And let's ceremonially and literally clean this place up and get rid of this evil influence. Okay? And neither Nehemiah nor Jesus really confused love with being nice. You can still love people and not be so nice sometimes. Sometimes you can love them and not be nice. I loved my daughter, but I wasn't always nice to her. She loved me, but she wasn't always that nice to me either, you know. So sometimes you have to be a little harsh to get people to understand that what they are doing is not right. And we're going to make it right, okay? But both had the wisdom to know when to take bold action. All right, let's see the next couple of verses. And I also discovered that portions of the Levites had not been given them. In other words, the things that people were supposed to be giving, tithing, to be given to the Levites so they can do their business. And the Levites, you know, who were specially chosen to be gatekeepers and singers and musicians and things of this nature, they weren't getting their contributions from the people. Okay, so the Levites and the singers who performed the service had gone away, each to his own field. What do you think that means, each to his own field? Right.
They had to go make a living.
They had to go make a living. They had to eat. And if they weren't getting the contributions from the people, then they had to go back. And you're right. You're exactly right. They went back to their allotted portions of land, and then tried to raise a crop, tried to do something to feed their families. And so the work of the temple, deteriorated because of that. Okay? And that was another issue that Nehemiah had to deal with, okay? He said, so I reprimanded the officials and said, why is the house of God forsaken? Then I gathered them together and restored them to their posts. All Judah then brought the tithe of the grain, wine, and oil to the storehouses. And in charge of the storehouses I appointed Shelemiah the priest, Zadok the scribe, and Pedaiah of the Levites. And in addition to them was Hanan, the son of Zachar, the son of Mattaniah, for they were considered reliable, and it was their task to distribute to their kinsmen. Remember me for this, O my God, and do not blot out my loyal deeds, which I have performed for the house of my God and its services. Okay. So Nehemiah discovered that the people had not been contributing to God as they should have been. Therefore, the house of God, as he said, had been forsaken, as well as the Levites and the singers. So he took 2 steps. The first thing he did, according to the verse we just looked at, was he restored the singers and Levites to their prescribed duties. Okay, all right. Get off your farm, get back in here, start doing what we need you to do in the work of the temple and the work of serving God in the temple worship and so forth. That's the first thing he did. And secondly, he reorganized the collection, the accounting, and the distribution of people's tithes and gifts. And the verse that we just looked at said all Israel began to do that, to give 10% like they were supposed to, and to give it to the right people. And then, did you notice he put very responsible people in charge of that? He had a priest. If we look back there to that verse, he said, so I appointed these people. First, I appointed Shelemiah the priest, and then Zadok, who was a scribe, which was what Ezra was, a scribe, somebody very familiar with God's word, okay, and Pedaiah of the Levites. So he had a scribe, a priest, and a Levite. And in addition, he appointed this Hanan guy, who was the son of Zachar, the son of Mattaniah. Why? Because they were considered reliable, okay? Sometimes you have to... Obviously, the people who were supposed to be doing it weren't doing a good job of it. So you throw Tobiah out and you put people in charge of it, because obviously, the priest Eliashib had not done a good job at all. He let Tobiah have a big room, so now I'm going to put some people in there who will make sure you do it right. Make sure you do it right. Okay. Otherwise, if you don't, the thing is going to recur. The problem is going to recur. So you got to put somebody in there. And I think it's very admirable of him that instead of putting one person in charge, he put a priest, he put a scribe, he put a Levite, and he put a man with a good reputation from a good family. And together those men could together make sure that and that's a checks and balances kind of thing. Okay? So why is leadership there? All right, let's look at the next few verses. In those days, now, this is one thing after another. Okay, is that hard to read? All right. Okay, sorry about that. So what has he found out so far? Well, he's found out that the Ammonites and Moabites are in the assembly, and Tobiah's got a special room, and people aren't giving for the work of the Levites and the gatekeepers and stuff. Poor old Nehemiah. Then what else does he find? Well, this is what else he finds. In those days I saw in Judah some who were treading wine presses on the Sabbath, and bringing in sacks of grain and loading them on donkeys, as well as grapes, figs, and all kinds of loads. And they brought them into Jerusalem on the Sabbath day. So I admonished them on the day they sold food. Also men of Tyre was in Phoenicia. Tyre was a coastal city in Phoenicia. So it wasn't even in Judah. It wasn't even a part of Israel either, okay? So men of Tyre were living there who imported fish. Like I said, it was a coastal town. Imported fish and all kinds of merchandise and sold them to the sons of Judah on the Sabbath, even in Jerusalem. Poor old Nehemiah's got to reprimand some people again. Then I reprimanded the nobles of Judah and said to them, what is this evil thing you are doing by profaning the Sabbath day? Now listen to this. He really tries to hit home with this. He says, did not your fathers do the same, so that our God brought on us and on this city all this trouble? Yet you are adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. He said, did you not learn the lesson of your fathers? This was part of the stuff that they were doing. Not getting rid of foreigners, not tithing, not honoring the Sabbath day and so forth and so on. And look what happened. We spent 70 years in exile. You just want to let that happen to us again? Is that what you want? That's what he's saying, okay? He said, yet you're adding to the wrath on Israel by profaning the Sabbath. It came about that just as it grew dark at the gates of Jerusalem before the Sabbath, this would be like Friday evening when the sun was going down, okay? I commanded the doors should be shut and they should not open them until after the Sabbath. So he said, all right, we're going to close the gates at sundown on Friday. And they're not going to open again until Monday morning. Okay? Got it? We're not going to let people carry on business during the Sabbath day, especially people that aren't even Israelites. Okay? So, then he said, then I stationed some of my servants at the gate so that no load would enter on the Sabbath day. Once or twice, the traders and merchants of every kind of merchandise spent the night outside Jerusalem. Maybe hoping they could slip in there. He said, then I warned them and said to them, why do you spend the night in front of the wall? If you do so again, I will use force against you. Okay? And from that time on, they did not come on the Sabbath. So Nehemiah apparently his threatening language was pretty powerful. And I commanded the Levites that they should purify themselves and come as gatekeepers to sanctify the Sabbath day. For this also remember me, O my God, and have compassion on me according to your loving kindness. Okay. So, when the people were supposed to rest, many were treating the Sabbath day as if it was just another day of the week. Okay? And foreigners sold, and people of Judah bought. And the issue really was that doing business had taken precedence over honoring God. Okay? And that was what really rattled Nehemiah. That was a day that the foreigners should have been told not today, so that they could spend the day resting and devoting it in worship to God and thinking about God, not being distracted by everyday business transactions and things of that nature, as well as labor. So Nehemiah did not wish to see Judah and Jerusalem fall again. And basically he said, I'll get physical with you. I'll get physical with you if you don't get out of here. And you know what? They got out of there. Okay. So, but we know he had some servants. We know he had some authority. He was governor. And he said he used his servants to station at the gates and so forth. So he had some manpower that he could use under the authority of the king of Persia. You know, he wasn't usurping his authority. Okay. Now, look at the last few verses. And so we have to add something else to the list. Okay, so let's think again of what he's seen. Okay, he's seen Ammonites and Moabites added to the assembly. He saw Tobiah having a big room in the temple. They got rid of that and everything. And then he saw that they weren't contributing like they were supposed to and so forth. And the Levites and the priests weren't being taken care of and all that kind of stuff. Then he finds that they're not honoring the Sabbath day like they're supposed to. But he's not done yet. In those days, I also saw that the Jews had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab. Okay. Remember when they did this before? I thought they fixed all that. They did for a little while. Okay. So, as for their children, talking about these Jews who had married women from Ashdod, Ammon, and Moab, as for half spoke in the language of Ashdod, and none of them was able to speak the language of Judah, but the language of his own people. In other words, they were speaking in the languages of the Ammonites and the Moabites and the Ashdodites. Now look, Nehemiah was a tough cookie. Look at this next sentence. So I contended with them and cursed them and struck some of them. I take that to mean he beat some up.
Who's the them, do you think?
I think he's talking about the Jews who married the foreign women. Yeah. So, and he said, struck them and pulled out their hair. Whoa! Raise your hand if you like somebody pulling your hair out. Whew. Nope. You know, kids get in trouble at school for pulling a girl's hair and stuff like that. You know, that's just something you don't do. It's painful, and I can't spare it, so don't even think about pulling them out. But that's a pretty rough thing to do. So he struck them. He pulled their hair out. You think he was serious about this? Yeah, but it wasn't just because he didn't think they should be marrying foreigners. It's because God said don't marry foreigners. Let's see what else he has to say about that. Okay, so and made them swear by God, you shall not give your daughters to their sons, nor take of their daughters for your sons or for yourself. Did not Solomon, king of Israel, sin regarding these things? Yet among the many nations there was no king like him, and he was loved by his God. And God made him king over all Israel. Nevertheless, the foreign women caused even him to sin. Do we then hear about you, that you have committed all this great evil by acting unfaithfully against our God, by marrying foreign women? And he goes on to say, even one of the sons of Joiada, the son of Eliashib, the high priest, was a son-in-law of Sanballat the Horonite. So this Eliashib, he was related to both Tobiah and Sanballat. What a jerk, you know. And he was giving him
Tobiah and Sanballat, they're like a bad penny. They keep showing
they
up.
keep showing up. Yeah, they just keep showing up. They're just keep like a bad penny in circulation. You can't get rid of them. Okay. So I drove him away from me. He drove Joiada, I guess, away from him. You know, you got to get rid of it. You got to go right to the root of the problem. Okay. And again, he says, so then remember them, oh my God, because they have defiled the priesthood and the covenant of the priesthood and the Levites. Thus I purified from everything foreign and appointed duties. I purified them from everything foreign and appointed duties for the priests and Levites, each in his task. And I arranged for the supply of wood at appointed times and for the first fruits. What he's talking about there is the people of Judah would cast lots to decide who was responsible for bringing wood into the temple. Okay, wood was an important thing because they had to keep the fires going. Then the fire of the altars and things like that were perennial fires. They had to keep them going, and the way they kept them going was by people providing wood, fuel for that kind of thing. And the way they did that was through a lottery system where people who lived outside of Jerusalem would bring wood in. And apparently they had neglected that. So Nehemiah reinstituted that, and he also appointed times for the first fruits. The first fruits would be those who lived outside of Jerusalem, who had farms and gardens and things. The first batch of tomatoes they brought in, or whatever it was to be given to the priests, Levites, and the temple. And that had been neglected. And so Nehemiah restored that. And that's why he said, remember me, oh my God, for good. So apparently Nehemiah's time away from Jerusalem had been lengthy enough at times for the people to start marrying foreigners again. And this was pure disobedience. And who did he cite as an example of how bad it was? Solomon. Solomon had 700 wives and 300 concubines. When Solomon took over as king after David, the nation of Israel was probably at its very peak at that time. Okay, they were a very wealthy kingdom. They were a very expansive kingdom. They very well might have been the most powerful kingdom in the world at that time. I think Solomon reigned about 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. Okay, and he started out so good, and he asked God for wisdom, and God said, because you asked for wisdom, I'm going to give you wealth, and I'm going to give you fame, and I'm going to give you power, and so forth. But apparently the power kind of went to his head, and he just had a real weakness, like his father David did, for women, and the women just led him away from God. So that after Solomon, his son Rehoboam, succeeded him as king, but only for 2 of the tribes, and Jeroboam, who was not a relative, took the northern 10 tribes and established the northern kingdom of Israel. So things fell apart. Things fell apart during that reign of Solomon. They went from the first day of Solomon being the most powerful kingdom on the face of the earth to being a divided and very weakened kingdom after that. Why? Because of the influence of godless people. And the point he was making with Solomon, as he said, was, if that can, he said, look at Solomon. He was once loved by God and ordained by God to be the king. And he loved God, but then he was influenced by these foreign women. And I hate to put the blame on the women, because he even says women also married foreign men, and that was just as bad, But he fell into the influence of people who didn't have a care in the world for God, and who practiced idolatry and witchcraft and everything else. And he said, if it can happen to Solomon, do you think it's not going to happen to you? Yeah. So he had to put a stop to it. All right, so this was pure disobedience. Nehemiah's reaction was fierce. We read the words that he used to describe how angry he was about it. And it's a reflection really of how seriously he considered the matter to be. Moving on. Nehemiah's prayer is the appeal of a good conscience. 3 times he says, remember me, oh my God, for good. And Nehemiah prays, I think, that God will understand that he really did do the best he could to lift Judah and Jerusalem to a state that would be pleasing to God. And most of the time he had to take the bull by the horns. But he didn't, I think it's commendable of Nehemiah that he didn't always try to do it all himself. He put other people in charge. Now I've cleaned this up now. Your task is to keep it cleaned up. And that's the sign of a good leader who can relegate authority and not be so dictatorial. Okay? So, but in Nehemiah 10, the people promised not to have ungodly sexual liaisons. They promised not to buy and sell on the Sabbath. They promised not to fail to support the work of God with money as he commanded. But by Nehemiah 13, they failed to keep all these promises. But just in the span of these 3 chapters, and we read that back in chapter 10, and we read about how they really wanted to do what was right, and they read the book, and they said, we need to start doing what's right. And they all said, we're going to do that, we're going to do that. But it's just difficult. It's just difficult. Unless there are people like Nehemiah who pat you on the back and say, come on, straighten up. You can't do that. That's not pleasing to God. Okay. All right. Rules, covenants, vows, promises, they're really ultimately powerless to stop sin. You can make rules that say, thou shalt not. And you can make covenants and vows. And, if vows were the answer, we wouldn't have any divorces, would we? And promises, they're ultimately powerless to stop sin. Only God's grace in our lives gives us the power to truly overcome sin. Each one of us on our own, we're just not going to be able to do it. We just can't do it. We're just too weak. We're just, the influence of, for us, not so much the influence of foreigners like it was in this time in idolatry. It's just different forms of idolatry. It's just the world telling us that, you know, this is a better way, or you don't really have to do that, or you can do this instead and you're still okay, you know, that kind of thing. So we have to be careful. But what we have that they didn't have was the grace of Jesus. And when we accept him and we are cleansed by his blood and strengthened by his spirit that he provides for us, then we are recipients of that grace, which does give us an assurance that we sit right with God. Okay. And finally, Nehemiah is finished. No more am I going to struggle.